Welcome to our channel. Today, we're diving into the gripping story of secrets, betrayal, and consequences in a small, peaceful town called Willow Creek. It all begins at a quiet cafe where a beautiful woman named Vivian, the owner, finds herself at the center of attention, especially from the town's men. But behind her captivating smile lies a web of hidden desires and forbidden relationships that will shake the town to its core. Get ready for a tale filled with drama, passion, and the high price of temptation. Stay tuned to find out how this story unfolds. The morning peace of Willow Creek was shattered by a mixture of yelling, bitter accusations, and mocking laughter. "I told you 100 times not to come here anymore. So why are you sneaking back? Oh, here we go again. What am I supposed to do? Just stay home all morning when I want a cup of coffee. Are you sure it's just coffee you're after? Or are you here to ogle that hussy?" That sarcastic, accusing tone belonged to Marge, a married woman who came to the cafe every morning. She suspected her husband, Bob, wasn't just there for coffee. He was clearly infatuated with the owner, Vivian. And Marge wasn't alone. Most of the villagers didn't care for Vivian. She was strikingly beautiful, her clothes far too stylish for this sleepy town. The Willow Tree Cafe had only been open a few months. Thomas and Vivian, the owners, were newcomers, renting a house in town and trying their hand at running a business. At first, they hadn't attracted much attention. Then, word spread like wildfire about the beautiful, charming, and flirtatious cafe owner, with a voice as sweet as honey. Soon, men were lining up every morning, eager to chat with Vivian and steal glances at her. And it was true, Vivian was stunning. You'd never guess she was in her 50s. An age when most women in Willow Creek were already grandmothers. The argument between Marge and Bob raged on as the other customers watched and gossiped. Vivian, standing nearby, had heard enough of the insults hurled her way. She walked up to them and said calmly, "Listen, honey, you can yell at your husband all you want, but leave me out of it. I'm a married woman. My husband's right over there. Have some respect." Thomas, standing inside the cafe, shook his head at the vulgar display. He was a retired schoolteacher who'd brought his wife to Willow Creek seeking a peaceful retirement. But it seemed their little cafe had managed to disrupt the town's tranquility. Thomas knew Vivian better than anyone. He had brought her here to escape the temptations of the city. She'd been a dancer, her career demanding long hours and late nights. He was 20 years her senior, and as he aged, he couldn't keep up with her boundless energy and desires. He had overheard the whispers about his wife, the accusations, and it had pained him. That's why he decided to move to this quiet town. But perhaps he had been naive. Thomas trusted Vivian completely. Surely, at her age, she was done with such foolishness? He wanted to defend her, to put a stop to the gossip, but he couldn't bring himself to stoop to Marge's level. So he remained silent. Vivian maintained her composure, meeting the other woman's gaze with a cool indifference. "Why don't you take your husband home, honey?" she said softly. "And maybe don't come back." She turned and walked away, her ample hips swaying enticingly with each step. Bob's eyes followed her, a hungry look in them. With her chin held high, Vivian moved confidently through the cafe, seemingly oblivious to the desire in the men's gazes. One pair of those eyes, however, belonged to Samuel. This was his first time at the Willow Tree Cafe, despite living less than a block away. He'd heard the gossip, chuckled to himself, and thought nothing more of it. But then yesterday, on his way home from work, he'd seen her sweeping the patio, the setting sun casting a golden glow around her. The image had haunted him all night, disturbing his sleep. Samuel had been divorced for 2 years now. 2 years of solitary nights. And now, this vision in a summer dress had roused a longing he thought long dormant. He hadn't even bothered with breakfast this morning, rushing out to the cafe instead. And now he couldn't take his eyes off her. He followed her every move, mesmerized by the way her curves filled out her clothes, the flash of her long, tanned legs as she moved through the cafe. He'd never seen a woman so beautiful, so close. Desire coiled in his gut. Vivian passed by his table, and as if by some strange impulse, he called out to her. "Excuse me, ma'am?" She stopped, turning to face him with a smile that made his heart race. "Can I get you something, sir?" Yeah," he stammered, even though his cup was still half full. Could I get another coffee? Vivian raised an eyebrow. What kind of coffee, hun? She asked, her eyes locking with his. Something passed between them, some unspoken connection. They held each other's gaze for a beat too long before quickly looking away. She disappeared behind the counter to pour him another cup, leaving Samuel to stew in his own desire. He knew she'd seen the hunger in his eyes as he'd watched her. She returned with his coffee and, to his surprise, pulled up a chair across from him. Just like that, she was chatting with him, as casual as if he were any other customer. First time at the cafe? She asked. Don't believe I've seen you around before. Yeah, work's been busy. He managed. Finally had a chance to stop in. You new in town? That's right, haven't met all the neighbors yet. I live just over there, Samuel said, pointing vaguely in the direction of his house, his eyes lingering on her ample bosom, straining against the fabric of her blouse. The one with the white picket fence. Oh, how about that? She chuckled. Right under our noses. You'll have to bring your wife and kids over sometime, let us welcome you properly. Right, yeah, I will. He mumbled, his eyes giving away more than he intended. Vivian saw right through him, her lips curving into a knowing smile. This woman, he realized, was no naive small-town wife. She was a woman who knew what she wanted, especially in the bedroom. Free-spirited and confident, Vivian embraced life on her own terms. Even at 50, she still felt the pull of desire, a spark of excitement whenever she saw a man with strong, capable hands. And Samuel's hands. They ignited something within her. Something she hadn't felt in years, especially compared to her aging husband. A customer called out, needing to pay, breaking the spell that had fallen between Vivian and Samuel. She went to ring them up, then returned to her work, but not before slipping a piece of paper into his hand. Her phone number. Samuel's heart soared. The woman he desired clearly felt the same. He spent the rest of the day clutching his phone, longing to text her, but fear held him back. It wasn't until a few days later that he finally worked up the courage to send a simple message, just letting her know it was him. To his surprise, she replied almost instantly. Can we meet? Excitement warred with anxiety. What if it wasn't actually Vivian texting? What if her husband had her phone? He called her immediately. The line connected, and her warm, melodic voice filled his ear. Hello, it's me. My husband's going out of town tonight, can you come over? I. Samuel stammered, completely caught off guard. He couldn't believe how easy this was. Come around back, she whispered. I'll be waiting. And then she hung up. He replayed her words in his mind, trying to process what had just happened. He'd been attracted to Vivian from the start, but he never dreamed she felt the same. He glanced at the clock. Almost 10. Most of the houses were dark, the occupants already asleep. He grabbed his jacket and headed out, slipping through the shadows towards the back of Vivian's house. As he approached, he saw her silhouetted in the doorway, a single light illuminating her figure. He crept closer, his steps silent, acutely aware of the risk he was taking. What time will your husband be back? He whispered, his voice tight with apprehension. Don't worry. She chuckled, her voice like honey. He won't be home until tomorrow. Tonight, I'm all yours. Her words banished his last shred of hesitation. He closed the door behind him, locking it with a soft click. All he could see was Vivian, standing there in a slinky nightgown that left little to the imagination. Desire, raw and urgent, surged through him. He captured her lips in a kiss, his hands roaming her curves, needing to touch her, to feel her warmth against him. He inhaled the scent of her perfume, the sweet, heady fragrance stoking the fire within him. Her hands were tangled in his hair, her nails digging into his scalp, her soft moans driving him wild. This, he thought, was how a woman was supposed to respond. Thomas, with his strict morals and advancing age, couldn't begin to satisfy the fire that burned within Vivian. But Samuel, divorced and starved for touch, was eager to fulfill her every desire. His hands, rough and calloused from years of manual labor, were surprisingly skilled as they explored her body, eliciting gasp after gasp from her lips. He was like a musician, coaxing a melody from a finely tuned instrument, guiding her through a symphony of sensations. 2 weeks passed, and Samuel could find no opportunity to be alone with Vivian. Thomas, her ever-present husband, was always there, helping her with the cafe or reading poetry in the corner. Vivian, for her part, couldn't find a way to slip away at night. They were both restless, haunted by the memory of their shared passion, aching to be together again. Finally, Samuel could take it no longer. He decided to risk it all. That evening, he walked over to the miller's house and knocked on the door. "Vivian? Vivian, are you home?" Inside, Vivian was lying on the couch, watching television, while Thomas was absorbed in a book. She sat up, startled at the sound of Samuel's voice. She pretended not to hear, hoping he would go away. But Samuel was persistent. "Vivian, hello, is anybody home?" "Someone's at the door," Thomas said, glancing up at her. "Aren't you going to answer it?" She couldn't very well ignore him now. Heaving a sigh, she got up and headed for the door. "Who would come calling at this hour?" she muttered. "Don't they know people have better things to do than answer their door all night?" She reached the front room, but before she could open the door, Thomas called out again. "At least put a sweater on, Vivian. You'll catch a chill." "Yes, dear," she sighed, grabbing a light cardigan from the closet and shrugging it on. She opened the door and froze. Standing on her porch, a hopeful smile on his face, was Samuel. "Samuel, what are you doing here?" she whispered, her eyes darting nervously towards the street. "Thomas is right inside. If he sees you." "I had to see you," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I miss you. You haven't answered any of my texts. I thought maybe I could catch you at home, when your husband wasn't around." "He's going to get suspicious. Just give me a little time, I'll find a way to message you, I promise. But you need to go. Now." She tried to push him away, but he grabbed her hand, holding her gaze. "Please," he whispered, his voice thick with longing. "Just one kiss. I need to feel you close to me again." Vivian hesitated, torn between desire and fear. She couldn't risk it, not with Thomas just a few feet away. She stepped back, putting some distance between them. "Samuel, I can't. Not now. Please," she said, her voice louder, hoping Thomas would hear. "We're closed for the night. Come back tomorrow." She slammed the door shut, her heart pounding against her ribs, and turned to face Thomas, who was watching her with suspicion. "Who was that, Vivian?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "Someone you know?" "Just some guy wanting to know if we were still open," she said dismissively, trying to appear nonchalant. "Imagine that, asking for coffee at this hour. Some people." Was all he said, but the look in his eyes told her he wasn't convinced. Vivian knew she was playing with fire. Thomas might be a trusting fool most of the time, but she knew better than to push her luck. And yet, she couldn't deny the pull she felt towards Samuel. Lately, everything reminded her of him. She couldn't get his touch, his scent, out of her mind. To make matters worse, Samuel had recently taken a job as a foreman at a construction site a few miles outside of town. His new job meant longer hours, less time at the cafe, less opportunity to see her. A whole month passed without them even exchanging a word. Desperate, Samuel finally decided to send her a text message, asking her to meet him at the construction site on Sunday, when the workers would be off. He didn't receive a reply, but he held on to hope, spending his lunch break waiting for her in a makeshift shack near a pile of bricks. He had no idea how much his text had unnerved Vivian. She paced the floor of their house, desperate to see him, but unable to come up with a believable excuse to leave. The cafe was busy, Thomas was always underfoot, and then, inspiration struck. Clutching at the excuse like a lifeline, she told Thomas she was having terrible stomach cramps and needed to go to the Willow Creek Medical Center. He insisted on calling her a taxi, concerned by her pale face and trembling hands, but Vivian refused, claiming she needed to drive herself, that the fresh air might make her feel better. Thomas reluctantly agreed. Moments later, Vivian was in her car, a giddy sense of freedom washing over her as she sped towards the construction site. She parked just outside the construction site and called Samuel. He'd been waiting for her, spirits sinking with every passing minute, but at the sound of her voice, he dropped everything and raced to meet her. The site was deserted on a Sunday, located on a quiet stretch of road rarely used by anyone other than the occasional work crew. Still, Vivian proceeded cautiously, scanning the area for any sign of onlookers before following Samuel into the site. The midday sun beat down relentlessly. Even the feeble breeze from a rusty fan did little to dispel the oppressive heat. Samuel led her to a small shack, its entrance covered by a makeshift curtain, separating them from the outside world. And then, like a starving man presented with a feast, he was in her arms. "I've missed you," he groaned, his words muffled against her skin. "Me too," she breathed back, her voice shaky with anticipation. Their kisses were urgent, desperate, their bodies clinging together as if they could erase the weeks of longing with a single touch. Samuel wasted no time shedding their clothes, his hands hungry on her skin. The first time they'd made love, the darkness had shielded them, but now, bathed in the harsh glare of the midday sun, every curve, every freckle, every imperfection was laid bare. It only heightened the intensity, the sense of forbidden pleasure that pulsed between them. Vivian closed her eyes, giving herself over to the sensations, the familiar yet exhilarating feel of his hands on her body. She'd spent countless nights lying beside her husband, her mind conjuring up images of Samuel, of the way he made her feel, and now, finally, it was real. She pushed aside any lingering guilt, any thoughts of the potential consequences. All that mattered was the here and now, the exquisite pleasure that was consuming her, body and soul. Samuel was a force of nature, his passion as raw and powerful as the summer storm brewing on the horizon. The flimsy shack seemed to tremble under the force of their lovemaking, their cries of pleasure echoing in the still air. Vivian, unable to contain herself, cried out, her voice wild and unrestrained, fueling his own desire. He moved faster, harder, lost in the moment, their bodies slick with sweat, pressed together until there wasn't a sliver of space between them. Just as Samuel was about to reach his peak, the shrill ring of Vivian's cell phone pierced the air. He went still, his breath catching in his throat. Vivian's eyes flew open, instantly recognizing the name flashing on the screen. Thomas. With a flick of her wrist, she silenced the call, her expression hardening. It rang again, but she ignored it, her attention returning to Samuel, her body demanding his. He obliged, pulling her close, and they were soon lost in another wave of passion. Afterward, they lay tangled together, spent and sated. Vivian finally pulled away, reaching for her clothes. "Thomas is expecting me back," she said, her voice breathless. "He's probably worried sick." "Let him worry," Samuel mumbled, pulling her back down beside him. "Just stay a little while longer. Or better yet," he added, a mischievous glint in his eye, "why don't you leave him? Come live with me." Vivian laughed, a throaty sound that spoke of both amusement and sadness. "Leave Thomas? And what about my children? My reputation? What would people say? What do they matter?" he said, nuzzling her neck. "We have something real, something special. I know you feel it too." "Oh, Samuel," she sighed, running her fingers through his hair. "I do. Believe me, I do. But it's not that simple. We can't just throw everything away. Not yet, anyway." "Fine," he said, his voice laced with disappointment. "But promise me one thing. Promise me you'll meet me again, next Sunday, right here, same time." "I promise," she said, her voice husky with desire. "Now, let me go before he sends out a search party." They shared a long, lingering kiss, a silent promise exchanged between them, before she reluctantly pulled away. Vivian slipped out of the shack, her clothes slightly askew, a contented smile playing on her lips as she drove back to town, leaving a very satisfied Samuel behind. Vivian returned home, her cheeks flushed, a spring in her step. But she wasn't greeted with her husband's usual solicitous inquiries. Instead, she found herself on the receiving end of a glare. "Where have you been? I've been calling you for hours." Thomas snapped, his voice tight with annoyance. "I was indisposed. What's all the fuss about?" I can't very well answer the phone while I'm driving, can I? Indisposed? Vivian, it took you more than 2 hours to get back from the clinic. Do you have any idea what time I called? Oh, for heaven's sake, Thomas, I'm exhausted. And my stomach is still killing me. Believe me or not, but I need to lie down. Vivian brushed past him, a carefully crafted look of irritation on her face, and shut herself in the bedroom. Thomas stared after her, his face unreadable. He suspected she wasn't being entirely truthful, but he wasn't one to pry. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. Later that afternoon, Mr. Henderson, their neighbor, stopped by for coffee. He mentioned seeing Vivian's car speeding off towards the construction site earlier that day, wondering aloud what business she could have had there. Thomas froze, his mind racing. He knew Vivian hadn't gone to the clinic, and now he knew where she had actually been. A few discreet questions later, he discovered that Samuel was working at the same construction site. Suddenly, everything clicked. The lingering glances, the accidental touches, the way they seemed to light up whenever they were near each other. Thomas had seen it all, even though he'd tried to ignore it. He was no fool, no matter how much Vivian might want to believe otherwise. He wouldn't confront her directly, not yet. He'd been down this road before, turning a blind eye to her indiscretions for the sake of their family, for the sake of appearances. 3 years ago, he and their son, Michael, had caught her red-handed at a motel, another man in her bed. She'd cried, begged for forgiveness, and promised it would never happen again. He'd been a fool to believe her then, but he'd forgiven her. This time, however, there would be no second chances. This time, he would be ready. Meanwhile, Vivian, invigorated by her afternoon tryst, was a changed woman. Her usual irritability vanished, replaced by a carefree gaiety that had been absent for weeks. She found herself humming as she worked, her eyes sparkling with a newfound zest for life. Sunday couldn't come soon enough. She began dropping hints, asking Thomas about his plans for the weekend, feigning indifference as she casually mentioned that some of his old friends from out of town were coming to visit. He played along, his face carefully blank as he told her they'd be staying for a couple of days, maybe longer. As soon as he was out of earshot, Vivian sent a quick text to Samuel, her fingers flying across the screen. He'll be gone all weekend. Come over? Their plans were set, a delicious secret shared between them. Neither of them realized that their carefully constructed web of deceit was about to unravel, the threads of their affair leading straight into a trap of Thomas's own making. Sunday finally arrived, the fateful day Thomas had been waiting for. Vivian was practically giddy with anticipation. She'd barely slept the night before, her mind a jumble of Samuel's hands, his scent, the way he made her feel so alive. Even as Thomas was leaving, she couldn't contain her excitement. Drive safe, darling, she called out, her voice laced with false concern. And don't stay out too late. You know how much help I need around here. Don't worry yourself, he replied, his voice carefully neutral. I'll be back as soon as I can. Try not to overdo it while I'm gone. Maybe hire some extra help if you need it. They shared a quick, chaste kiss, a charade for the benefit of the few remaining customers. As Thomas pulled out of the driveway, he could almost feel the weight of their gazes, the envy and admiration radiating from the other patrons. They're such a sweet couple, he heard Marge whisper to her friend. You'd never guess they've been married for so long. He's so attentive to her. Not like some husbands I could mention. Thomas fought back a humorless smile. If only they knew. He waited until he was out of sight before pulling over and calling Michael. It's time, son, he said, his voice grim. Meet me at the cafe in 10 minutes. As soon as Thomas was gone, Vivian received a text from Samuel. He's gone? I'm on my way. Heart leaping, she glanced around the cafe. Only a handful of customers remained. She flipped the closed sign on the door and busied herself with clearing tables, her mind already elsewhere. Moments later, Samuel let himself in through the back door, his eyes immediately seeking her out. He found her in the kitchen, a vision in a short, clingy dress that showcased her long legs. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, pulling her close, his lips finding hers in a hungry kiss. You look beautiful, he murmured, his hand stroking her bare arm. Wordlessly, she led him upstairs, her fingers already fumbling with the buttons of his shirt. They tumbled onto the bed, their bodies moving together as if choreographed, a familiar dance of desire. But just as Samuel's hands found the curve of her hip, the bedroom door swung open, flooding the room with light. They froze, their bodies entwined, a tableau of guilt and betrayal. Thomas stood in the doorway, his face ashen, his eyes burning with a cold fury. Beside him stood Michael and Emily, their faces a mixture of shock and disgust. Vivian's breath caught in her throat. "Thomas," she stammered, scrambling for words that wouldn't come. Samuel, his face flushed with shame, sat up abruptly, fumbling for his discarded clothes. "Thomas, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean." "Get dressed, Samuel," Thomas said, his voice deadly calm. Vivian scrambled out of bed, grabbing a blanket to cover her nakedness. She fell to her knees before Thomas, tears streaming down her face. "Thomas, please, I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. Please, forgive me. I'll never do it again, I swear." She turned pleading eyes to her children. "Michael, Emily, honey, please. Tell your father I'm sorry. Mommy made a mistake, but I promise, it won't happen again." Michael, his jaw clenched tight, stared at her with a look of betrayal that cut deeper than any slap. He'd been the one who found her with the other man 3 years ago. He'd been the one who begged his father to leave her, to stop letting her hurt him. But Thomas, ever the forgiving fool, had insisted on giving her another chance. He wouldn't make that mistake again. "How many times, Mom?" Michael spat, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "How many times do you have to break Dad's heart before you realize you don't deserve him? I don't need a mother like you." Vivian's pleas were drowned out by the sound of her own sobs. But Thomas remained unmoved. His heart, once filled with love for this woman, was now a cold, hard stone in his chest. He fixed his gaze on Samuel, who was still struggling to pull on his shirt. "You seem to have a fondness for my wife, Samuel," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Perhaps you'd like to keep her company permanently?" Samuel, his face a mask of shame and fear, didn't meet his eye. He knew he'd been caught, that there was nothing he could say or do. "Get out," Thomas said, his voice flat and cold. "Both of you, get out of my house." Vivian didn't remember leaving the house. One minute she was on her knees, begging for forgiveness, the next she was on a Greyhound bus, speeding away from Willow Creek, away from the wreckage of her marriage, her family, her life. The only things she had with her were the clothes on her back and the bitter taste of regret. She'd lost everything: her home, her husband, the respect of her children. And for what? A few stolen moments of pleasure? A fleeting thrill that had cost her everything? She'd been a fool, blinded by desire, sacrificing the love of a good man for the fleeting attention of another. Samuel's parting words echoed in her mind, a hollow refrain that offered no comfort. "We were wrong," he'd whispered, his voice thick with shame. "I'm sorry, Vivian. We can't see each other again." Now, she was alone, adrift in a sea of unfamiliar faces, the enormity of her loss crashing over her like a tidal wave. 50 years old, and starting over with nothing but the bitter knowledge that she had only herself to blame. Back in Willow Creek, Samuel was persona non grata. The villagers, their whispers carrying on the wind, ostracized him, their judgment a tangible weight that followed him everywhere he went. He shut himself away in his empty house, the shame of his actions a constant companion. He'd known it was wrong, knew that Vivian was married, but he's convinced himself that their connection, their shared passion, justified his actions. Now he saw the truth, the ugliness of what they'd done. He'd helped destroy a family, and for what? A few stolen moments of pleasure that now felt as empty and meaningless as the promises they'd whispered to each other in the dark. Eventually, unable to bear the whispers and knowing glances any longer, Samuel packed his few belongings and left town. No one knew where he went, and no one asked. Thomas and his children never spoke of Vivian or Samuel again, the details of their betrayal a dark secret buried deep within the walls of the Miller house. Life in Willow Creek went on, but for those involved, the memory of that Sunday, of the betrayal and heartbreak, lingered like a shadow, a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of giving in to temptation. One could only hope that somewhere, somehow, both Vivian and Samuel would find a way to rebuild their lives, to learn from their mistakes and find a love that didn't come at the expense of others. As the dust settles in Willow Creek, the consequences of betrayal and broken trust linger like a shadow over those involved. Vivian, once the captivating heart of the town, is left with nothing but regret for the choices that cost her everything: her family, her home, and her reputation. Samuel, too, finds himself ostracized, burdened with the shame of his actions. Both are forced to confront the painful reality that their fleeting passion came at a devastating price. In the end, Willow Creek moves on, but the memory of their affair remains a stark reminder that some temptations come with a cost too high to bear. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this.